Okay, if everybody's ready, I'm going to get started.
Yep, we're good to go.
Great. So I want to welcome everyone. And my name is Marcy Peterson, and I'd love to hear from those that are new to this series and new to Wheaton Arts. We'd also like to hear from you and know where you're listening from. Wheaton Arts is thrilled to celebrate its 50th anniversary as one of the most unusual and creative landmarks in the Northeast. Founded by glass magnate Frank H. Wheaton Jr., the first Wheaton Arts buildings opened to the public in 1970. 50 years later, Wheaton Arts has become an international hub for artists exploring the limits of their creativity and a reception for the region's cultural diversity. It has additionally earned national and international recognition for its unique collections and programs. Wheaton Conversations will continue in 2021 to engage us with this virtual series highlighting select and diverse artists with ties to Wheaton Arts. On January 21st, we'll visit next with Vanessa German. A few things to go over. I wanted you to know that this is a webinar, so you will not be seen, but the participants and the moderator will be seen and heard and also recorded. What we'd like for you to do is ask the questions in the Q&A box. You can chat with me and look for links in the chat box, but the Q&A is where you'll ask questions, and we'll have those questions at the end of the session. Should you lose connection for any reason, don't worry. Please just close the windows on whatever device you're using and go back to your original email. You'll be able to join in again. We'll still be here. And just to touch quickly on the three types of support for Wheaton Arts, one is memberships, donations, and shop.wheatonarts.org. I will drop Rhodey's information into the chat box if you'd like to reach out or have any questions. And if you want more information on how to support Wheaton Arts, you'll be able to contact Rhodey Barron, Director of Development. And now my coworker, Pamela Wakeman, Director of Education and Artist Services at Wheaton Arts, will take over. This evening, she will moderate the questions you ask in the Q&A window, so don't be shy, ask questions, and she may be able to interject them as we're going along, but otherwise, then they'll be asked at the end of the session. Hi, Pam.
Hey, Marcy, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see so many familiar names on our list, and I'd like to welcome you back. And for all of you, those who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We're glad you are here tonight with us. It is my pleasure to be here with you and to introduce our guests. Our first guest is Anjali Srinivasan. Anjali's background in creative practice stems from collaborations with traditional glass artisans in India since 1998 on research and design initiatives aimed at socioeconomic empowerment. Anjali's studio processes focus on developing ways to discover, access, and restructure information held in a material. She makes self-eroding objects that remain unfulfilled and incomplete without human intervention. Her studio promotes socially responsible glass designs and studies how material imagination sustainability speaks to the creative empowerment. Anjali lives and works between India and the United States as an assistant professor at Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston and as director of Chochoma Studios in Bangalore. Anjali was a Creative Glass Center Fellowship recipient at Wheaton Arts in 2009. Our second guest is Alexander Rosenberg. Alex is an artist, educator, and writer based in Philadelphia. His artistic practice is rooted in the study of glass as a material, in conjunction with broad interdisciplinary investigation, crossing over into many other media and research areas. Alex pursues his practice with artist residencies, teaching performances, and exhibitions locally and internationally. He was cast on the Netflix series Blown Away in 2018, and he currently teaches at Salem Community College. Alex was a Creative Glass Center Fellowship recipient at WheatonArts in 2018. I would like to take this moment to remind those who are watching that questions are encouraged. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions throughout the program. I will pose them to our guests as they relate to the topics being discussed. Anjali and Alex, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
And it's such a pleasure to have an excuse to do something as kind of part of an arts community. You know, it's a little bit lonely sometimes in my studio right now. It was great to have an excuse to, you know, connect with Anjali and see what's going on in her studio and put this together. So, and thanks to everybody for coming. What we're going to do is kind of give you a brief introduction to a few projects that represent a certain aspect of our respective studio practices. And Anjali and I are going to kind of talk about a couple of areas of overlap, and then we'll open up some questions to you. So I like to start with this slide that shows examples of the types of things that I'm making when I go and work into the glass studio. And even though the projects that I'm going to talk about after this are a little bit less obviously glass, I want to try to talk about glass as like as a studio practice, or as kind of a framework and methodology for working with other disciplines and other materials. So like a lot of the kind of throughout the slides, I'll be kind of asking, like, you know, what is it to do this through the lens of glass? What is it to work with this kind of particular topic in a glassy way? And one example of that I like to talk about is when I go into the studio and I make these kinds of things, they're not really my designs, you know, they're more kind of copies of things that you see in a museum or a book. And glass is a literal recording of movement, which is something that's very exciting to me. So I know that if I go in here and I like perfectly reproduce an object that I saw in a museum or in a book, I'm also reenacting a series of movements that was performed by a maker, another maker, hundreds or even sometimes thousands of years ago. And to me, this kind of connection across time that can happen because of that performance is really exciting. It's a way to kind of connect with somebody that I wouldn't be able to connect with otherwise. So that's kind of an example for me of, like, you know, what it is to do historic research in a glassy way. Can you do the next slide, please? So this is, I am interested in history, and this project I made when I moved into the neighborhood that I live in now. It was commissioned for part of a book about wonder. And can you do the next slide, please? Sorry. And I live in Philadelphia, and I live near an abandoned coal power plant. And one of the things that I realized early on is there used to be this kind of plentiful, inexpensive resource, and that was kind of the source of a lot of the power in the city. And the area was all lit up. And then as that resource became more scarce, the light, there was kind of a scarcity of light as well. So I knew that I wanted to do something in the neighborhood that put a little bit more light back there. And I decided to make this. I took a neon class and I made this neon sign that was supposed to look like an anatomical heart. And I mounted it in the window at the top of my house. And it can be seen from the highway or from boats on the river. And it hooks up to me while I sleep. There's a little heart monitor that I wear on my finger, and the neon sign blinks with my heartbeat. So the idea was, like, I could ask my doctor to look through binoculars and see how I was doing, or I could ask people in the neighborhood to kind of keep tabs on me. Next slide, please. So I do have this interest in kind of public space and the history of the city that I live in, and I was really fortunate to be part of this project in Philadelphia in 2016, 2017 called Monument Lab, that was curated by Ken Lum and Paul Farber, and I kind of fell into it as the city is a planned city, and I was there was a different artist assigned to each one of the squares in the city, and I was assigned to Rittenhouse Square, and it was a pretty hard site to work with. There wasn't much rhyme or reason to it, and if you look at it from its earliest iteration, it kind of went from kind of a wooded area full of natural stuff to being totally deforested, to being like a trash pile. It started off as kind of a really rough neighborhood, and then it grew to be a very kind of the most expensive and wealthy neighborhood in the city. And I realized that like what I wanted to do with that site was to be able to see all of those iterations like layered on top of one another, or at least some aspect of them. So I use this coin-operated viewfinder. There's actually two of them on two sides of the park looking inward. And it created this augmented reality interface where you look through these viewfinders and you can swivel your view around. Next slide, please. There's a little 3D video here that you can see kind of an example of what it's like to look around in there. And I had these kind of animated examples of some of the documented items over time. So you can see there's like an observatory that was proposed and never built. It's like a training ground for the Revolutionary Army. There was written about this albino deer that people would see when it was a wooded area. Different fountains, sculptures. You could move on to the next one. There's this residue of the Great Chalk Wars of 1911. And here you can see people burning their draft cards. One of the first Pride parades in Philadelphia started there. Different iterations of transportation. I read about like giant piles of horse dung when they were starting to have horse-drawn carriages along the trolley tracks, or horse-drawn trolleys. Yeah, so I think that's that. Let's move on to the next one. The other thing that I think was exciting to me about that project was as I kind of was moving along in these projects, I'm becoming like more and more uncomfortable with making things, just kind of with like what's going on in the world, like this kind of environmental crisis that we're in. And I liked that project that I was kind of making an interface more than making an object, and like making a way for people to find their way through space. And that kind of carries forward into this next project, which is it's a site-specific project at Eastern State Penitentiary, which is another weird, cool institution in Philadelphia. It's simultaneously, you know, speaking of sites that have different identities over time, it's a tourist attraction that is the first penitentiary. Like it's a preserved ruin, and it's a fine arts venue. And walking around, you know, as it's kind of preserved in the state of ruin, I think about the collapse that we're heading for, like all the kind of problems with the natural and built world. And I was thinking about, I'm a hobby climber, and I was thinking about taking this kind of recreational outdoor activity and superimposing it onto kind of the crumbling built environment. Like, how do we use this stuff that we made when it doesn't work as what it was intended to anymore? So let's, next slide, please. So I came there, and I proposed that I was going to climb every route possible on the interior on the inside of the exterior wall of the former prison, rate those climbs, and create a guidebook of it. And you can see here, this is an aerial illustration of the penitentiary. It's a Panopticon. So if anybody here has, you know, gone to grad school and read Foucault, this is the thing that that he was writing about. And I will badly briefly explain what a panopticon is, which it's basically a tool of control where a single guard could be in the center of that guard tower in the middle, and each prisoner is in solitary in a cell. They can't see who's next to them, but the fear of being able to be seen by that single guard kind of prevents them from getting out of line. Let's go to the next slide, please. So that's me sitting on top of the wall on the bottom there, and you can see it's totally unusual to have this weird structure in the middle of a big city. There's also some super weird sound stuff, like when you climb, when you're inside the penitentiary, the walls kind of keep out the sound of the rest of the city. And then when you poke your head over the top, like the sounds of the city come rushing back in. It's a very unusual experience. So let's go to the next slide. So serendipitously, the prison closed in 1971. And the next year, the Cunard Equipment Catalog, which was basically like what was later Patagonia, wrote this essay called The Whole Natural Art of Protection. They published this essay. And it was kind of imploring people to conserve rock in the same way that they wanted to preserve other natural resources. So they kind of had these new materials, and they made new climbing stuff, and they were encouraging people to try this new kind of climbing called clean climbing, where you wouldn't alter the rock by climbing it. Next slide, please. And those kind of constraints overlaid really well on the way that people are asked to intervene in the ruin of the former penitentiary, because it is a national historic landmark. It's kind of treated with similar reverence and kind of care as a delicate natural resource. So I wanted to use that kind of ethic, climbing on the walls of this prison. So next slide, please. There's also, to make this book, we're trying to figure out how to show people like where these climbs are and how to climb them. And there was this really wonderful form of notation that existed already. So there were over 100 escapes from that prison during the short time that it was open. And when somebody got out, this is from the 1940s, they take a photograph and draw on it these little kind of arrows with a grease pencil. So next slide. You can see that was kind of the notation that I ended up using. We got this very great high resolution photograph of the inside of the wall, and I did these paintings in gouache of the ways that they go. And then inside the book, next slide, please. Each climb is named and rated. They're all named from excerpts from Warden's journals, which is the kind of only records of these people that had climbed out the same way that I had. And kind of thinking back to that same that first slide, I think it's kind of similar in the way that this like performance, like this way of moving through space can connect me and the other climbers with people from the past. This is one of the cells with this installation of the gear that was used for the climbing, which was built using materials that would have been available to people when the prison was open. Also in the book, there's like interviews with formerly incarcerated people who taught me how to make this stuff. Next slide, please. So thinking about this kind of growing concern about the future and about the environment. When I was on the series Blown Away, one of the challenges was to do like a lighting design. And I think the glass blowing on this could use a little bit of improvement. I'd like to remake this, but the point is, I was really interested in this kind of 19th century moment when interiors were switching over from candlelight to electricity. And I wanted to make something that was kind of for the reverse of that. So this one, the cord just ends up kind of being the thing to hold up this candelabra. And when the lights go off, you can put the candles in. Next slide, please. And this is kind of what's going on in my studio right now. I'm making this is like a prototype for something that I'd like to be a larger chandelier. And I'm using these salvaged electronic parts. And that's something else that I'm kind of thinking of about glass as a material in the future. It's like all over the screens of our devices and the lenses of tiny little cameras and things. The idea of this is there's a single candle burning, and maybe because that electronic waste is so much more plentiful now than things like wax or string, you know, maybe the candle will be kind of more valuable and the electronics will be cheaper. And a single camera superimposes a video feed of this screen into these water lenses. And that's, there's these, in these kind of Victorian interiors that I was interested in, there would be these glass spheres filled with water to disperse candlelight. And then in some of them, as as electric light was introduced, that same kind of technology was used to disperse the light. So that's kind of what I incorporated here. Next slide, please. And this is the last thing that I'll talk about. I think like many of you, 2020 was a little bit of a surprise year for me. And I did have some very fortunate and great plans. I was named the 2020 Proctor Fellow, and I was going to go travel to ANU to do some work there. And I also was fortunate to receive a residency at RARE, which is Recycled Artists in Residence here in Philadelphia. It's like literally you go to the dump for recycled materials and work with the people there to learn more about the way these things move through the world. So kind of between those two places, I was really interested in looking at glass as this kind of bushcraft material, like a material for primitive human survival. And these are just some examples of some of the research of that. Like you can see on the lower left, there's this form that I've always been really interested in. It's a flycatcher, but this same kind of formal language is used to capture other types of creatures in the world, like the one up on the top that looks like it kind of looks like a pig on four legs in the middle there. That's for trapping minnows and small fish. On the far right, this one's actually exciting to me because it's kind of a common practice right now. It's this flint napping, like what you would see in a obsidian arrowhead or like simple primitive tools. People are using the bottoms of glass bottles to do that now, I think just because it's plentiful. And that's kind of the thought about this, that like maybe bushcraft doesn't have to be as much about like nature, but just what's around, you know? And if you look at all these kind of regional traditions, they do kind of incorporate different types of waste, you know, that might be really plentiful in the area. Upper left is a glass fishing buoy. You can see there's a sediment water filter and a solar still, and then kind of this very simple using a lens to start a fire. Next slide, please. So I think those are the projects that I'm going to talk about for right now, and I'm going to pass it on to Anjali, who's going to tell you a little bit about her work.
All righty. Thank you, Alex. I have so many questions for you. I've been taking notes like a very good student. So I can't wait for the conversation. I am so happy to be here. This is such a great way to start 2021. So Happy New Year, everyone. Alrighty, thanks, Marcy. I thought I would start with a project that I did during my fellowship at Wheaton. These are blown glass vessels that are flexible. When you touch them, they quiver. When you poke them, they sort of bump. You can fold them. You can throw them across the room. And they have this incredible sound to them. And over the years, I've really come to enjoy the way they animate viewers. Could I have the next slide, please? So In about 2008 to 10, Yuka Otani, a colleague of mine who now lives in Japan and works in China sometimes, she and I received a Creative Capital grant through the Andy Warhol Foundation to curate exhibitions that hosted works by emerging artists who were addressing the thing that Alex mentioned. How do you work with glass without using glass in the known way, in the most accessible way? So as curator of that exhibition, I had a glass glove and I greeted every visitor to the exhibition space with that glove. I believe there were about 42 handshakes in 2 days. The image on the top left is the glove when I started out. The image on the right is what happened to the glove after the handshakes. I'm showing this because this object sort of really spoke to me that I have this need for humans to activate the object. And while doing so, acknowledge that everything that we touch with our action actually ages with our touch. We're actually killing something as we activate that thing. So I became very interested in the idea that objects around us erode with time. They're not self-contained. We are implicated in their framework. Could I have the next slide, please? So I got really interested in this idea of how does one communicate that the human touch has the ability to transform something. When you touch something, you bless it. You sort of bring your energy to it. And light is, glass, light, all connected. But light is one of the most effective ways to do that. So this is a project that I did with Swarovski, the crystal company. It debuted in Design Basel in, forget the year, I can't remember, 2016. Got that. Okay. And what it is a landscape that goes from unrefined, dirty glass to this highly refined, highly QC'd, sparkling machined crystal. And your ability as a viewer to go there, touch the glass, and for it to light up. So people were drawing. We had toddlers coming and sort of trying to interact with light, and that was pretty beautiful to watch. Next slide, please. I'm also very interested in taking glassmaking outside of my studio, outside of the walls of the studio. The world is my studio. That's how I look at my practice. And I'm also trying to challenge this idea of an artistic genius. So I started making games. I would have rules. I would set up systems. I would give people a blowtorch and with very thin filaments of glass and pose questions to them with those rules and have them build the sculpture. So what you see on the bottom left corner is an arch that people built at Dubai Design Week. On their own volition. I didn't start telling them go build an arch. Literally, people came in. I showed them how to use a blowtorch, told them, you need 3 points for it to be a stable thing, and you can't make something 12 inches long, and like very basic rules. And they built things themselves. Could I have the next slide, please? What's interesting about this project's happened about 7 times in 6 different countries. And what's really interesting is as soon as I gave up ownership of the creating process, it opened up the space where viewers were makers, where viewers felt like they owned the making of something together, being very aware that what they were making was not going to last. It was an ephemeral thing. They were willing to be invested in an object that they knew will die. And therefore, their attention changed to the other person was working across them and starting to get to know that person. I have seen people transform, have the most amazing conversations, get to know other people, resolve fairly difficult discussions, and build empathy with each other while building these projects. We did this in Seattle once where we did it on a street corner, and we had sort of lawyer type people interacting with homeless people who are waiting for the shelter to open. That was very interesting, just hear them being willing to talk about their lives as people. And I've started to think about my way of art making as something that disarms people, that bridges gaps, and it is heavily leaning towards conflict resolution at this point. The idea that something that is crowd created can bring people together to figure out answers and conversation and conflict in other realms through the conduit of working with glass. Could I have the next slide, please? Um, like um, like Alex, I have also over the past decade felt a deep discomfort with making objects that's been sort of growing. I enjoy the process of glass making. It just doesn't make sense anymore. You know, it feels horribly indulgent with not as much reward for me personally. And I started asking myself, well, you know, why does my object need to exist in a world that has a bazillion objects already? You know, and that's why I really like Alex's way of replicating the movement of someone to sort of connect to someone in the past. I think that's amazing. I didn't find that moment, but what I did find, for me, the most direct way to deal with this discomfort of mind, materials, energy going into a process to make something that is decorative, was I was living in Dubai at that point. It's in the Middle East, for those of us who don't know where Dubai is. Huge luxury driven market. And I was running the region's only hot glass studio. And my way of dealing with this discomfort was to start upcycling glass, to take all the waste glass from that region and invest it with love and time and effort and creativity and transform it into not just recycled glass, but something that is of value. So I sort of have a product design degree before I started glass. So it sort of kicked in. And that was my most immediate response to the crisis I was facing. So on the right are some things that we made in the studio for various clients. And on the left was our collaboration with the largest waste management company of the United Arab Emirates at that time. Could I have the next slide, please? My background is originally, I'm from India. That's where I studied. That's where I went to college. I have my design degrees from India as well. And as part of my education, I worked with artisans all across the country on different craft traditions. So India is very special in that every village is inhabited by a community of artisans. So you might walk into a village of potters, you might walk into a village of sand casters, you'll walk into a village of bell makers. And of course, now that is sort of dying, but I think that's a very special sort of local economy situation to have grown up in. And what you're looking at is some footage that I have of glass bangle makers. They have small clay ovens. He's taking a rod and rolling it in some frit, what we would call frit. And he's got a conical shape that we could call a mandrel. What he does is he smacks it, as you're going to watch now. He's going to do womp, womp, womp on it after he heats it up. And that little marver, or I don't know what railing, is actually the rail track, the track that the trains run on. That's how they make their tools or procure their tools, which I think is really ingenious. So he's going to bring it out. He's going to make a donut with the glass. And he's going to literally spin it on the cone to create a bangle that will fit my wrist. So when you work with these people, you show them your wrist. They're like, okay, your wrist is blah, blah, blah size. And then they know exactly how far that cone to go to. So I was working with communities like this. Could we go to the next slide, please? And a lot of my efforts were centered around, gee, I don't want to see this die. I want these traditions to thrive. I want them to live. I don't want to live in the space of preservation. I don't want to live in the space of, oh, I'm going to conserve and talk about and honor what is already gone. I actually wanted this to be an active, sort of vibrant place of being for these people. So my initial work with them was to run workshops. I would host workshops. This is a workshop with flame workers, and we would develop new designs. We would do small technical improvements to their process. We would start creating other types of products that could diversify their line. The idea was that they could earn a better income, that their craft practice was sustainable, that they were proud of being artisans, and it was something they were going to continue. Could we go to the next slide, please? However, I've noticed there's a difference between when you work with someone else and it is transactional. I would say the previous slide that I showed you was a transactional encounter. It's very simply, there's a design workshop, let's make stuff. The slides that Marcy's putting on right now, I would put in a different category of collaboration, which is the one I'm invested in right now, which I'm going to say is transformational, where an artisan works with me, both of us, do a residency together. And we sort of just brainstorm and explore and see what the possibilities are for Bangles. We're not aiming at a certain product, we're not aiming at a certain thing, but we're literally seeing what is it that each of us has to offer to transform the other person's practice. And that is something that I am really, really invested in doing these days. You can go to the next slide, Marcy. One of the other things that I'm really invested in is changing the perception of how people think glass is or what it is. So I developed puffy glass, which is a porous glass substance. Could you go to the next slide? It's essentially flour and baking ingredients that are mixed into glass powder and then fired in kilns. You can also work with it in the glory hole. But it reveals a wide range of associations that people don't normally associate with glass. And I find that really gratifying when people can come up to work and say, huh, that's glass? How? Wait, what? I think that's a really interesting place to get someone to in order to disarm them and get them to see something beyond what they think they know. Could you make the next slide, please? I also make chocolate dipped glass pebbles. I promise you I'm not trying to poison people, but I have puffy glass that's dipped in semi-sweet chocolate, very nice tempered chocolate, and I give these away at exhibitions. And it's a really, it's been great showing this work over the past, 13 years or something, because people take these and then they try to lick the chocolate off sometimes, which is sort of scary. I haven't gone to jail for that yet. But also over a period of time, encounter a chocolate that's blooming and sort of turning into yuck, but a glass that is not. And encountering a glass that is really lightweight, but the chocolate is heavier than the glass. So just to get people to encounter objects in a way that you normally would not interests me deeply. Next slide, please. At one point, I was working with John Crawford, who's a soil research scientist. He used to be in Sydney, now he's moved to the UK. We were trying to grow barley in puffy glass because it has these beautiful capillary sort of like pores that run all the way through. So we were like, oh, we could use capillary action and start growing things in them and the roots would go through everything. Went really well till we lost funding. However, I became very interested in this idea that, next slide, please. The idea that what if the glass sculpture were held together only because a living thing held it together? You know, kind of like roots running through ruins is what holds those structures together. What if my sculpture were actually held together because there is something alive around it and through it? So my latest experiments, next slide, please. My latest experiments involve trying to develop a biodegradable glass that is blowing friendly, that sustains craftsmanship and investment into technique, but also provides nutrients to plants, and in doing so erodes itself and dissolves back into the earth. My idea is, okay, it'll be like a zero mining and waste equation by the end of this. But I'm trying to figure that out. That's the first iteration, or the second iteration that I did in 2020, and it's already starting to erode a bunch, but I haven't tried to grow anything in it yet. And I believe we're down to my last slide. Next slide, please. So I'm really interested in finding new ways to work with glass, finding reference points outside the studio glass movement to approach glass with. I constantly ask myself, why do I need to make something? What is the value of what I make? Why mine, deplete, make more stuff in an overcrowded world? Why does and how should climate change affect my thinking as an artist? What is glass? The image you see on the left is slime mold. It is a little yellow goop that most of you probably seen it when you went hiking. It hides under logs of wood, sort of decaying matter. Slime mold is, it doesn't have a nervous system. It doesn't have a skeleton. It's not like, oh, I've got a body and this is my little globular surface. It actually just demonstrates very, very high levels of what people call social intelligence through herd mentality. Like one little slime mold bumps against the next one, says, hey, food's there. Next one bumps against the next one, says, food's there. And in that way, they find the shortest path to cellulose or like tree trunks to eat. And what I'm trying to do is get them to push glass particles around and be able to build glass surfaces. Again, like this is so totally, that is on paper clay. The one on the right is my experiment on paper clay. Went well. Now it's time for them to push silica. But this is kind of where I am in my little artist studio. And these are the ways I'm dealing with my, ooh, what should I make as an artist? And what is the value of what I do? And how can I change something around me? That's all I got for you.
Thank you guys so much. Anjali, we do have a question for you.
Okay.
This is coming from Paul. He asks, how does the Quiver glass get its flexibility? Does it crack with repeated flexing? How is it made?
Okay, so yes, it cracks every time you touch it. So the glass is blown to be eggshell thin, not like cellophane thin, but eggshell thin. So it's not thick enough to actually cut your finger, but it's not thin enough to blow away. And what happens is I blow sphere. I should have some in my studio, but I blow spheres and then I silver them and then I put silicone in them, a pourable silicone, and then I flip them inside out because now they're flexible. Well, I first break them. So this is what I do. I get really angry with something that happens in the White House or the Capitol Hill or something like that. Then I break a glass sphere. And now I have this broken glass sphere that's held together by silicone. And then I'm able to flip it inside out. And now it's flexible and it brings joy to life. But since I'm going to meddle with it, because it brings joy to my life, I'm going to kill it. So every time I use it, Paul, it's going to crack further and further and further and further to become dust eventually.
Thank you. That's awesome. At this time, I just want to invite everybody to, if you have questions, to begin asking them. And again, if you see that Q&A feature within Zoom, please type them in there and I will pose them to Anjali or Alex. Guys, before you begin with your questions, I just want to touch on something you said, Anjali, about your work with glass. Kind of acting as a conduit for conflict resolution, that also connected with human interaction being such an important part of your work. In my experience with glass, and especially engaging younger people, sometimes they don't want to touch it. They're afraid to touch it. So have you ever experienced that when someone approaches your work, and how do you raise their comfort level to engage with the work in a way you either hope that they would, or in ways that you could never imagine that they would? How do you raise that comfort level?
I think because I'm making objects that fundamentally are not meant to be pretty and sitting on a pedestal or a wall, people are like, I've never encountered a situation where there's a quiver vessel with the glove in a gallery and no one wants to go play with it. I've never had that happen. You know, that just doesn't happen. When I'm wearing a glass dress and walking down the street, yeah, you know, people might be intimidated to come to me, but they're going to come and they're going to be like, this is a very shiny human being. I have to go and touch her. Oops, I just touched this brown girl's body. This is really awkward. Now I have to say something. I'm so sorry. I'm like, oh, no problem. Where are you from? You know, and then it turns into this amazing conversation that object facilitated, right? So my way of handling it is literally just implicate the person within the framework and use. I think Alex and I and every artist who's attending this webinar, we're very fortunate that we understand what glass does. It is so exciting. And I feel like sometimes we get carried away with the object being the outcome as opposed to the thing that excites us that we are discovering with the material and then using that as a way to initiate action somewhere else. So I always think about the work is happening outside my object. My object is not the work, right? It's the thing that makes the work happen. And that's how I've been approaching all of the social practice and all of the conflict resolution work that I'm doing. So yeah, people are usually afraid. It's mostly, well, I don't know how to be an artist. I'm not creative, you know, like I've never made anything before. I'm really clumsy. Those are the apprehensions I deal with. I've never encountered it's glass, I'm not touching it. You know, yeah, not happened yet.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and sharing that that spark and sharing the thing that creates the work, that process, and all those little discoveries. That's something that obviously at Wheaton we really focus on, and we invite people in to witness that process so they can really get those moments and savor them. Alex, but before you guys again go to your questions, I have one question for you. If people are interested in the Climber's Guidebook that you did for Eastern State Penitentiary, or if they want to watch documentary video about you or see you climb, is that available for people to see?
I'm so glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked, person who asked. So yeah, the book is and the book is, I'm really proud of the book. I had some like really great designers that I got to work with, and it kind of looks like it goes with kind of the time. Like it looks like a like kind of a manual for like a Betamax, you know, like video machine or something like that. But yeah, so the best, you could get it at the in the shop at the museum in Philly, or if you want to, you can just send me a note and I'll get you one. It's cool when you buy it at the museum because a portion of it goes to conserve the wall, but I think we're still kind of on a lockdown here in Philly that makes it a little complicated. So if you want to, if anybody's interested in that book, you could just get in touch with me. It's $40, and I'll send you one. I should have mentioned too that the research stuff that I was showing, those other glass things, the idea of that is to culminate into another guide, like a survival guide for late Anthropocene about like specifically focusing on glass waste.
And I have another question within this topic of the climb. This is from Emily Baker. She is saying, in her experience as an athletic acrobatic performer, most of the time those performances are met with resistance and fear of injury. How do you convince whomever to allow you to climb these routes and on such seemingly fragile walls?
That's a really good question. I'm going to try not to say that anymore because that's a thing that I was noticing that everybody says all the time, but it is, thanks for asking that question. So mostly it just speaks to the really great people behind that institution specifically. I was shocked that they accepted my proposal. I was shocked at like the amount of freedom that they kind of gave me to realize the project to the kind of extent that I wanted to. So you know, it's a little hard, I think, to give. I mean, I guess the project was designed around the fragility and the constraints of the site. Like, actually, the stuff that they were telling me that I couldn't do was like that was what the proposal was about, right? Like, I wanted to make this connection between the conservation of this site and these kind of ethics of environmental preservation. And it worked really nicely. So I think, and you know, I guess to that same end, I have been doing other proposals to climb other stuff that hasn't been as, you know, as well received. Although, you know, I'm sure it will kind of eventually happen. But I think it's also just like having a really, you know, like I think like many of us, like I write lots of proposals all the time. And I think just like having stuff that's really, really appropriate to the site. The thing about that project that was so exciting for me was like, it couldn't have happened anywhere else, you know? It was like exactly perfect for that exact spot. And I think that, you know, I was really lucky that kind of the administration and the selection committee for that year saw that. I guess also like it helped that there was a lot of support from other organizations. Like once I got the go ahead, I kind of embarked on this, like, I kind of got like athletic sponsorship. I'm not like a wonderful athlete, but I, you know, was training for a year. I wanted to be able to do all the climbs that were there on the site. So I ended up getting support of like American Alpine Club, some of the local Philadelphia climbing gym. I got some like coaching. I got like gear pro deal stuff from Black Diamond and REI. And I think that's another thing, like having and I received a grant from an amazing thing called the Awesome Foundation. That is a real thing that gives kind of small and fast grants for these kinds of projects. And I think with all that other support coming in, it really helps another institution say, yeah, we're gonna support this.
Great. This question is going to a different topic. And this is coming from Christine Barney. Has the lockdown and pandemic given you inspiration or new ideas? And that is a question for both of you.
You want to go first, Anjali, so people
sure,
don't get sick of
I
me?
can go first. The pandemic has done a few different things. It suspended all programming like it did for everyone else. Everything that was supposed to happen last year is happening this year. It also gave me sort of time to just be alone in the studio and do things because there wasn't anything you could do outside. I'm someone who, until tomorrow, was like, public transpo, no owning a car. Like, I'm that person, right? And now I have to give in and get one. But given that public transport was not a great idea, I was like, okay, I'm basically going to either walk places or I'm going to hang out in my house and my studio. So that automatically reduces your radius tremendously. So I started wood burning and I started paying attention to the slime mold. I didn't kill them as much, you know, just things that the minutia that sometimes gets overrun by the larger noise. I've been paying attention to that. One of the other things, honestly, that has happened is I haven't made any work because what I teach. So I've been trying to get my students to work safely and happily and deal with the pandemic. So I've literally just been like, this year, not happening. I'm just going to be a teacher and a good one and support my kids and it'll be fine. You know, so that's what the pandemic has been for me. But I'm actually really grateful for being able to pay attention to small things in my studio. What's it like for you, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, well, I talked about this a little bit with some people or with some institutions in the kind of beginning of the pandemic. And there is something like, I do like to do residencies and kind of go to different places and institutions that support making work. And like, you know, just like what we did at Wheaton. And I think one of the things that I really value about that is it's like cooking over a campfire, you know, like the limitation, like I'm not actually a very good cook when I have access to everything, but I'm a pretty good campfire cook because like the limitation kind of inspires me a little bit, you know, like give me like 5 ingredients and I can kind of run with that. And I like that. I like making projects that are really specific to kind of like the resources or the place at the time. So, you know, for me, I teach at Salem Community College, which is also kind of the primary glass resource source, which I use, which I love because I kind of get to work with students, and there's kind of a social component to that studio. But you know, that access has kind of been intermittent. So kind of go from these periods of like make glass things, like all the things that you want to cook up, to like go back home and suddenly I'm working with like, you know, dish soap on an overhead projector and like looking at the bubbles on the wall. I think also, as you kind of mentioned, like slowing down a little bit. I do read kind of regularly, but I think I read a lot for like research and for the projects that I'm kind of trying to do, and less for pleasure. And I did get into like a pretty good like fiction habit again, you know, just being, you cut out all the travel to the different places that you go. There's like a few, you know, there's some extra time, you know, extra time in the day. But I quite like it. I mean, I think it's, I've even made like kind of invented some objects that are like pandemic related that allow you to kind of like see the outside world from your desktop. Like there's something very kind of Emily Dickinson, or like, you know, I got these very, very powerful binoculars that I can like see across the river into the windows in Camden. And it's, I've kind of leaned into the lockdown, I guess you could say. So that's a few things. Do we have more, or should I go ahead? You know what? I'll just go ahead and ask one. Anjali, I think. Oh, do you have another one?
We have one more. I'm sorry.
Cool.
One more that just came in. This is from Paul. Alex, what constraints were imposed on your climbing projects? Could you place clean or fixed pro, use top rope anchors, climbing shoes, caulk, boulder or free solo only? Did you pre-inspect the routes or climb them on site?
It sounds like you might climb. Yeah, so it was great. It ended up being like a really kind of a team effort. And I should say, like, there's this other thing. Oh, am I frozen to everybody?
No, not at all.
Okay, good. I just got a little freezing over here. So it kind of coincided with this like ongoing like conservation effort to conserve the wall. The wall is made out of Wissahickon schist, which is like, which is the rock that you would climb if you were climbing locally. You know, if you're going to the local crag in the Philly area, and it's what a lot of the older buildings in the city are made out of. However, I think they kind of used like the worst quarry stuff, like the bad stuff, for the inside. So it's this very, very kind of flaky and kind of abrasive rock. You know, I think maybe they got it at a bargain. They have the nicer stuff on the outside, but the inside stuff is kind of messed up. And the wall is also, it's like mortared on the outside and the inside edges. I'm sorry, on the outside and the exterior surfaces, but the inside is just a pile of rubble. So as it kind of water gets into it and it expands and contracts, it really degrades a lot. So we decided this project was going to kind of coincide with some of the conservation of the wall. So like each section that I would do, we would go up in it was actually cool. We had one of those articulated arm lifts. So like I didn't even have to climb it to inspect it and clean it. And we'd kind of, and I had these two wonderful engineers that were kind of inspecting it to make sure that it wasn't going to kind of collapse, and then to see what would need to happen to conserve it. In the end, we ended up setting up a top rope primarily, even though the interest was to lead it using natural protection, which I made. So each route has like the proper protection, but we ended up using the top rope too, has the ability to be led with, and I guess, I'm sorry, I should explain this to everybody else. It's like leading the route, it's like if you're the first person going up and the rope's not hanging overhead already, you can like place gear as you go and keep elevating your rope for safety. And these are these kinds of things that you would see like cams and chocks, like little things that fit inside of a crack and get locked when you pull down on them. So yeah, I ended up doing it that way to kind of get the roots and did a little bit more experimentation. I did actually have to wear pretty like high-tech climbing shoes, like super tight ones, because the harder roots, most of the foot stuff, like most of the feet were just like tiny little mortar lines. It was like my feet were pretty wrecked by the end because I trained for a year to be able to do it. So and then and then I did it. So hopefully that gives you, I feel like I'm devolving into boring to most people granular rock climbing talk. But yeah, it was definitely like a group effort, and that's what I like about it. Like when I do these proposals for other places, part of it is like inviting the community out to like clean the structure together to make it like available for climbing. And I'd hope to do one in the future where like everybody can climb a big structure like that.
Okay, so we're free and clear of questions for now. So if you guys want to continue with your conversation, then we'll wait to see if we get any more.
Yeah, I just, the thing that I was really excited to hear about in the discussion of your work, Anjali, was this idea of like designing the ends of objects when we create them. Like, and I think as artists, that's kind of, you think about stuff that goes on after you die and like if it's going to be conserved and things like that. And the idea of kind of building a death into an object is appealing to me. Also, like from a design perspective, like, how do we make stuff that kind of goes away when we're done with it? So I don't know, I guess like, your interest in that, do you see kind of that applicable to kind of a larger disciplinary conversation around like design and sustainability?
Well, I think less about it as the death of an object. Okay, firstly, disclaimer, I'm Indian. I don't believe in death, right? Everything's like cyclical and there's always reincarnation. Let's start there first. Okay, Alex, there's a fundamental problem in my brain here. But okay, apart from that, I think of these works as when I'm making them, I think it's important maybe to change the way we're thinking about the object as the outcome. And something goes back to what I was telling Pam, like I don't think about the object as the outcome. I think of the object as the beginning. And for me, it is, well, how can it dissolve, or how can it be the slime mold that sort of goes everywhere? So when I'm designing a project, I'm thinking about what is the dissolution of the object, not so much the depth, because I feel like that's too finite a word for my little brain to process. So I feel like, well, if something, okay, who likes to cook here, right? So apart from Alex, who doesn't want to cook with real ingredients, you know how like sometimes you can add the spices right at the end and it's always stuck there, versus you add the spices at the right time and it just melts into everything and you can barely tell, but it's there. It's embedded in the whole, like every particle of the food. I'm interested in that second thing where you can't tell what the object is, what the experience of the object is, and who the viewer or the effector is. That to me is a really different way of thinking about the death idea, if that answers your question. And that's how I'm thinking about when I'm designing this. I'm literally thinking about what will give me least ownership after making this. What makes this object disappear into the world and become the thing, something else? And that's how I'm thinking about designing.
I love that you kind of talked about like cyclical or even like reincarnation, because I think maybe that's a much better way to say it than to say a depth. Like one of the things that I was thinking about that I kind of mentioned when we were talking before is like, cheap, crappy architecture that springs up everywhere and is going to, be kind of collapsing in the next 50 years. What if you could kind of easily take it apart to build something out next time? Or like for me, when I'm digging through these kind of electronic devices and scraps, one of the big problems is like there's still a lot of good stuff in there, but it's very hard to like separate it into its kind of individual components. So I guess like, you know, do you think stuff should be made like that? You know, do you think like maybe, you know,
Wow.
like we could design like objects that like become something, you know, that are available to become something else in the future?
I mean, I think I'm very invested in it. I think you are too. When I look at your work and you're talking about the way that you address this sort of existential concern of making in this world, I'm thinking of your chandelier project that you shared with us, right? You're talking about the mediated experience of a screen, given the increasing lack of the material. That's a transference of that energy right there to something else that we do have access. That is a transformation that you're switching it. You're talking about the Minnow's Catcher project, which I totally love. Mostly because you had the Fly project in the How Is This Glass show many years ago. So I'm still like super fond of that. But this idea that you could reappropriate, you could be creative, you could mutate something, you could change something, something could evolve, it could break down, build up again. I think that's that's a very biological paradigm, but I think that's a great way to approach making in today's world. So I'm on that side with you, I guess.
You brought up the How Is This Glass show, which is like, I think the first project maybe that you and I have done kind of to get, well, it was your project, that your curatorial project that I was fortunate enough to be a part of. And just like, so that the people know what we're talking about, I made this, I was really, and I think it's good to the kind of the conversation of like working in a glassy way with stuff that's not necessarily glass, or like working with these like, I guess like kind of fundamental properties of glass that like might not necessarily be using the material itself. And in this, it was just this like totally stupid proposition, which was like, how would you tie enough? There's this, a friend of mine showed me that you could catch a housefly and kind of like shake it around for a minute so it got disoriented, which I know is kind of cruel, but this is a thing that people do. And while it's kind of getting its footing, you can carefully tie a human hair around its neck. And when it kind of gets stable again, you can fly it like a kite or like a balloon. And this kind of thought immediately followed, which is like, you know, could a person fly that way, like that, you know, by tying themselves to enough flies? And that kind of fantasy, you know, I think I talk to students about this sometimes, like where does like poetics live, you know, in a project? And to me, sometimes the answer of that is taking like a very simple proposal and seeing it through like well beyond its logical resolution. And I think there's something about that with glass. I think just because it's like such a kind of over the top, like the process that makes it is so kind of over the top, it kind of leads to these crazy projects. I think that kind of reminds me of your trying to design this like biodegradable glass. Can you tell me a little bit about what that process is?
I mean, right now I'm just doing the chemistry of it. I'm trying to build so much alkali, and I'm trying to hit up like the potassium and the, you know, the nitrogen and all the good stuff. Nitrogen is turning out to be a challenge, but literally trying to make a glass that's super, super soft, and I'm sure Dr. Jane Cook might want to pipe in, you know, feel free to put something in the chat. But yeah, I'm just sort of trying to figure out, well, what does that glass do? What does it look like? Is that going to break? I mean, it's been 8 months and the thing is already white and crusty on the outside. So I know the alkalies, like I know that's breaking down. Now the question is, can I grow something on it? So I feel like I'm still so early in developing that material and seeing how it behaves, that I don't know where it will go. And that's one of the things that I actually really like about your practice, is that you're using glass as a method, almost like a paradigm. You're not thinking of glass. I think of glass as a material, like something that gives agency to something else. But what I love about what you're doing is, sorry, I'm digressing. Forget the stupid biodegradable glass question. But I just have to ask you this. You're able to use like glassiness as a paradigm, as a viewfinder to a different place or a different time or a different person, something that was hidden from us and now becomes visible to us, like this impossible wish to fly through flies, or recreate the movement of a glassblower from centuries ago, or look at all the hidden histories of that park in Philadelphia through this device that you've built. And I feel like the question that you asked me earlier has a lot to do with this urge to connect to what's not connectable. And I would love to hear, and I think the biodegradable glass also does that to some extent, but I think you're doing it so fabulously. So if you want to talk about that, I'm all ears.
Yeah, I think we both have that kind of interest and connection, which is cool. That's like, it was nice to kind of discover that through this process. I think it's well, so when I think about like what kind of glass as a studio practice or as like a methodology is, I think there are these qualities, material properties about the material that kind of relate to these inherent themes, you know? So like, to me, like stuff that glass does, like kind of presence and absence and seeing the unseen and kind of like measuring and containing the natural world. Those are all kind of like glass related themes. And I think like, I also think there's like this inherent kind of performative and kind of social aspect of what kind of glass making is. And as much as like I know that kind of part of the theme of what I talked about here was like how I'm uncomfortable with making objects. I also love making objects, and I love like working, you know, working with glass in hot glass specifically. And one of the things that I like about it is it's like I go home and I'm kind of by myself in my studio, and that's great. But I go into this other setting and I'm kind of interacting with students and people are watching, you know, like there's always a crowd. And I have to think that there's something inherently social as kind of a like related to the material, you know, that what we do. So I think, I don't know, I think that those kind of looking for those connections is like maybe another one of these glass-like proper, I guess you could say like kind of social connection, I think is like a glass, you know, a glassy thing to do.
I like the thought of that.
Should we do one more? I have one more. Oh, I have another. Okay, I have another question for you. One more question for you. One of the things that I think like I was kind of excited about doing the research for this like glass specific bushcraft project is like trying to solve like kind of contemporary problems, looking at kind of a historic traditions, like different ways that people have historically used materials, kind of applying those to contemporary design problems. And, you know, it occurs to me that I don't see, maybe you know, but I don't see like any evidence of this Indian glass tradition in kind of, you know, North American glass. And well, okay.
Don't get
sorry.
me started, please.
But
you really want to go there?
But I'm so interested in like, you were talking about an interest in you know, trying to maintain these traditions, not
maintain them before they get killed. Yes.
Yeah. And I wonder like, you know, do you see it as kind of applicable to like, is there an opportunity to kind of use this kind of information, this technique like that's missed in kind of contemporary global glass making?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, like, is the world missing out? Like, you know, is there a way to kind of like integrate this technology and information in kind of like, I mean, you're an educator, you know, for example, and
I mean, on a personal level, sure. Like, so some of the things I've been doing is when I owned the studio, when I was running it, I hosted artist residencies. So people from this part of the world would come and stay with me for 3 months and they would sort of learn about all these oral histories. They would learn about the vocabulary of these craft traditions, and they would make work based on it. And the idea was that they would be a breath of fresh air coming to the traditions, and then the traditions could also move up outside their little silo. But I think I feel like it is easier for historical traditions of the West to seep into contemporary traditions of the West because they're well documented. I think it's like mostly the politics of the world. Most South Asian craft traditions are oral histories. There are people who are speaking completely different languages, completely different dialects. Literacy is not a written thing. It's embedded in your hand. You pass it down. It's just very hard to acknowledge, preserve, and showcase something in a museum if you don't know it exists, because the only people who do are so different. And I think that for me has been one of the most interesting gaps, is like, wow, that's really weird. It shouldn't happen. I do think there is space for that knowledge transfer to happen. And actually, I did a residency at the Museum of Glass a few years ago where I built, you saw that conical mandrel thing that I was showing you? We built a longer cylindrical one, which was slightly tapered out of stainless steel, and I brought it and we put that in the hot shop. And we started making sort of bangles in the hot shop that was compatible with, you know, COE 96, because gee, guess what? The Indian artisan doesn't work that way. And so we started making bangles at the Museum of Glass, and then we started blowing objects with the bangles around them like we do cane patterning, sort of like the Italian glass blowing crossed over with the Indian style vocabulary. And the objects were pretty darn interesting, Alex, right? But I feel like they're opportunistic. That's like, Anjali's interested in it. Okay, let's go do this. Or, you know, it happens on a very one-to-one level. It happens on that scale. And I think there's scope for transformation. I think we're missing out. But I think I could say that for pretty much anything, not just the crafts, if that makes any sense. It's not a very encouraging answer, but
well, but I love that example. That's perfect, of kind of, you know, like just kind of mashing it together with kind of Venetian style or Italian style glass blowing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an experiment, right? What's the worst that can happen? It looks ugly. Whatever. You know what I mean? No disrespect, done. I would love to hear more about your the sort of reappropriation of objects towards survival skills. You know,
do we have time?
I don't know if we. Sorry, Pam. Yes, tell us if we have time, because I think it's related to what you just asked me. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Alex and I can keep going. You should know that.
Yeah. So, well, so say again, you're talking about the reappropriation of like.
Yeah, I'm super interested in that project, and we talked about this like earlier in a totally different conversation. But this idea that there are objects that people made with very specific functions that are sometimes not relevant, applicable, or discovered today. Like, we don't have minnows catchers in our house, in our pond, we just don't do that. But sort of that, bringing that back into visible presence, and either as a mode of survival or as a mode of discovery, and also being respectful to what we made already but have sort of lost track of. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in the kind of super specific regionality of like bushcraft tradition. And I guess like I'm using that because that's kind of the word that I have for it in kind of the stuff that I've been reading. I think like, you know, it kind of intersects with like indigenous technologies, but I think bushcraft is like more of like a hobby outdoorsman kind of a thing. And for example, one of the things that I was noticing was like in Philadelphia, there's this weed that grows everywhere. So I live kind of in northeastern part of Philadelphia. There's kind of some, you know, some kind of rough neighborhoods nearby where there's a lot of homelessness and stuff like that, hunger, you know, drug problems, etc. And started noticing this weed that grows everywhere around Philly. It's called purslane, and it turns out like Thoreau writes about it on Walden. He basically, I think it's a lie, but he says that he kind of sustained himself off of it for a long time. It's a pretty interesting plant. It looks kind of like a succulent. It has like a little bit of like a citrus flavor to it. And depending on the time of day that you harvest it, it has a different taste to it. And there are like, you can find it in a restaurant, but like it appealed to me, the idea that like, there's this thing just like growing out of the ground, and where there might be kind of, hunger or lack of other resources, like with the right kind of knowledge or skill set. I'm not suggesting that like we feed people the weeds growing out of the ground, but I like the idea as kind of like a thought experiment of like knowing that stuff, to like a particular reason. So that's like, on one hand, that's kind of like one of my interests in doing the work at Rare, is like actually seeing like what's the kind of industrial waste, like in construction waste, that gets produced in this specific area, or that gets disposed of in this specific area, and what kinds of things can we do with it. And then I like kind of looking at that on top of like historic bushcraft traditions of the region, like knowing what previous solutions to these problems of like hunger and shelter and making hand tools and things like that, and kind of trying to see where those two things intersect.
And maybe someday what glass looks like if you use those to make glass.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then that's another kind of separate or kind of, it's a whole other can of worms that I'm really interested in, is like kind of trying to find all the places that glass kind of figures into these questions of like human survival, especially because I think it's like one of the hardest materials to kind of recycle in a way that isn't very kind of costly in terms of resources and like just expense, because it's very heavy. And as you know, in North America, we don't want to like wash bottles and put stuff back into it. We want to melt them back down and make a new thing again. So so yeah, anyway, those are just kind of some of the thoughts, or like the talking points on that.
We have a question from Devaria. Alex, have you ever wanted to work with another material besides glass? And that question could really go to both of you.
Yeah, I like working with lots of materials, and I think it's actually really kind of it goes in the vein of talking about like working with stuff in a glass like way. I made a project, kind of an example of that is I made a project a long time ago about a perfectly round house, like a radially symmetric house. And when I was kind of looking at that and thinking about like all the radial symmetry that I'm looking at, and thinking about when I do that studio practice that I was talking about, like making these vessels in the hot shop, I thought to myself like, oh, maybe that's like the way a glassmaker builds a house, radially symmetric. And so I think that's that kind of thing of like, I like working with a lot of different materials and processes. I don't really consider myself to be an expert in any of them except for glass, but I like to think that like my expertise in the one thing kind of allows me to work with other stuff in kind of a special or unique way, like in a glassy way. So I do, I mean, even like in my studio downstairs right now, I have some like metalworking stuff and some woodworking stuff. And, I also like, I live in a crumbling pile of bricks. So I do lots of like homeowner related type projects. But yeah, I like using what's around, and I really like learning new things. And I think that's another thing about these kind of like research projects that you've seen a couple examples of, is I like, I think also, okay, this is also a glassy thing, but I think like the process of acquiring mastery is like, and virtuosity is kind of something native to like what hot glass learning is. And I found that like, I really like that process, like less than like wanting to be like a master of stuff. I really like the process of learning stuff. And I also teach. So like, I think it's a useful thing to try new stuff all the time and be like an absolute beginner, and kind of, be empathetic in that way. So like, I like to do projects where like for the project, I have to kind of spend time flexing that muscle and kind of like developing a new skill set. And I like that, having had the experience of kind of like improving and approaching mastery in one thing, I can kind of like apply that stuff to kind of acquiring new skills and expertise. I think that's all I want to say about that. I'll pass it on to you, Anjali.
I think I'm doing the opposite of what you're doing. You're like, I know glass and I'm going to take it to everything. And I'm like, I'm going to bring everything else to glass. you know? So I look a lot to the history, the processes, the materials of fibers, especially natural fibers like banana, which behave very differently when they're wet and flexible versus dry and brittle. Um, so those are of interest to me. I'm also I play a lot with powders. I know that sounds weird, but I play a lot with powders and spices. So I have these installations that I make with turmeric and chocolate, where I line the walls of a space with little white bags that you don't really see, and each of those bags has turmeric and chocolate, and if you pull a string, it sort of scatters throughout the gallery. So over a period of a month or a week or whatever that is, the gallery goes from being a white clean space to being this colorful, smelly, fragrant, dispersing friendly, messy place. Very disruptive. I find that again, I think those materials just really help me think about dissolution. What does it happen? What happens when something you make disappears into the world? And then what happens when something is flexible? A lot of what I do is flexible glass. So fibers really helps me out with those. So I would say if I had to pick between like other materials, those would be the things I go to normally when I need to feel inspired. Although lately wood burning has been really helping me out here. So.
Thanks. We have time for one more question. This is coming from Benita. What adaptations have you had to embrace to teach glass to your students during this pandemic?
Oh, that was the one that we lied and said we were going to talk about. Why? I think, Anjali, I think you have a lot of interesting technology in that realm. Why don't you? I remember seeing your transparent mask.
Well, yeah, I mean, we made a bunch of so Amy Lemaire had this really nice 3D printed file that she shared with us for a adapter that fits into any mask that you can connect your blow hose into. And I'm talking about glass blowers specifically right now. I have a situation in my program where it's really important for us to make sure that the same learning opportunities are available for all our students, including students who need to read your lips or who can't hear very well, especially in a situation where you're wearing a freaking mask and you're talking to them. They're not going to get very far. So anyway, so I had this clear mask. It was a regular mask, but then had a clear plastic thing here with the little adapter with the blow hose going out of it. We also adapted the Corning Museum's foot pedal system. Our tech sort of changed that a little bit to make it friendlier for our students. And then we also had a few other, we basically had like 3 different ways for students to blow glass safely, so that they could pick the method they felt could work with their skill level, because the more advanced students were fine with the blow hose, the beginners couldn't use a blow hose, and that was just like very confusing. We also used our kilns as a heat treatment box every day, so equipment would go in there, would basically be exposed to dry heat overnight to sterilize and then come out. So we weren't pouring alcohol down things and asking students to use them. So stuff like that. So we did a lot of small things, nothing like super big, but a lot of small things that made it more comfortable and safe for students to work.
I loved the seeing that clear mask, which I kind of, I guess, like intuitively understood would be for the hard of hearing or lip readers.
Yeah.
But there was another thing about it, which I realized was a problem. I also was teaching with masks and blow hoses. So it's like a mask with a tube coming out of it. I didn't have a clear one. And one thing is, it's hard for students to tell when you're blowing and when you're not blowing if they can't see it. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's brilliant. I'm going to steal that for
Well, if you want the template, I'm
nice, yeah.
happy to share it. What was nice about that mask is it doesn't stick to your face. It actually has a gusset that comes out of your face and stays away from your face. So you actually, it doesn't like, you know how you don't feel suffocated with it while blowing on something? So that was really nice.
My solution, or my not resolved solution, was I wanted to have like a little LED that with a sensor in the line that when the pressure's on, it turns on, and then when there's no
fancy.
So maybe that, well, I don't know, but then I was like, oh, or you could just make clear stuff. Isn't that what we do, is make clear stuff?
Yeah.
So,
one of the other things we did for the blowing class was we actually provided people with Isomalt kits so they could practice at home. So when they showed up to their blow slots, they'd actually practice gathering, they'd actually practice blowing, they'd actually practice centering and jack lines with sugar at home. And so they weren't like, you know, panicking in the hot shop. So we were also prepping them with other things.
I think the one other thing that was just, or I'll just like mention it because I think it was so cool, is like, I ended up getting to teach like kind of the advanced version of glass blowing that we have at Salem. And the students did amazing. I just, because it's like, it is like kind of, you were saying, it's like making a hard thing harder. You know, you're taking glass blowing and then you're taking kind of like fine glass blowing, and then suddenly you have a tube attached to stuff going to your mouth, and they really did good at. And one of the things that, like, I guess it's not really like a specific hack, but like I had to go into the shop before each next unit and kind of like figure out what the like blow hose, you know, because we're doing like dropped blown feet and kind of these some of these fancy like Venetian techniques. And I have to say, it was all doable. It was all totally doable, and everybody showed up and did it. And glass blowing is kind of like a nasty, like germ-infested thing. You know, there are examples of pandemics that have happened among glass blowers in the glass industry. I saw an exhibition at the Mutter Museum in Philly ages ago about this awful, like, it was horrible, like a gross virus, like skin thing that was going on. So like some of that stuff of just like not sharing the ends of things with each other's mouths, like I could see hanging on to that, you know, in the future.
Thank you both for being with us here tonight. Up on the screen now, I just want to invite everybody, if they would like to learn more about Anjali and Alex and the work and projects that they're currently involved in, to visit their websites and to also follow them on Instagram. Their Instagram handles are there underneath their website addresses. Again, thank you both for being here. It was so great to catch up with you and see you during this time.
Thanks, Pam.
Thanks so much for having us.
And I know that Pam would love to hear from everyone. And if you have some ideas of what you'd like to see from us, from WheatonArts in the future, please reach out. Those links are in the chat. And if you'd like to get a copy of the chat, you can drop me a line too. Again, Alex and Anjali, thank you so much. This was so incredibly interesting and inspiring. Have a good evening to everyone.
Bye.
Bye now.